Hello, hi and welcome. So this is just a video to guide you through how you can use the scripts that I've described in my blog to set up HammerDB across your environment in an automated fashion using PowerShell. Just a quick introduction as to who I am. I'm a database administrator with around 7 years experience working on a number of different database projects, migrations, supporting Power BI, analysis services, all the different Microsoft SQL sort of services and that kind of stack. Most recently, I've been focusing some of my effort learning some of the Azure technologies and playing around with tools like this, like the HammerDB benchmarking tool, which hopefully if you've read my blog, you'll know that I've been finding that really useful. Okay, so there are a number of prerequisites that we need to get or acquire before we can actually start using the scripts. The first one being HammerDB itself, the tool and the executables that are available for free from the HammerDB official website. Then we also require DBA tools, as some of the scripts will use DBA tools to create SQL agent jobs and also insert data into SQL tables, the result data that you might want to report on at a later date. And then in addition to that are the actual scripts that I've put together, which are also freely available on GitHub. So to begin with, if we just go to the HammerDB website, probably the best way to do that would be to go to my blog, and then the links are on the blog down in this section here, the source code section, and the official HammerDB download is there on the site for you to use straight away. So when you get onto here, you get a number of different options. HammerDB is compatible with Linux systems and with Windows systems. I think it was originally used on Linux. Now, I usually download the zip version because it requires less space, and it's useful if you're going to be copying these files between different servers, which is what I would be intending to do in this demonstration. So what you can do is, if you just create a new folder somewhere on your internet enabled device, so Hammer install, and you can just download the zip version 4.1 into that folder that we just created. Hammer install. Okay, and then the second requirement is the DBA tools module that needs to be installed on the server from which you're intending to deploy HammerDB from. So essentially the way that the scripts work, you'll have a server in your environment and you will deploy HammerDB to different SQL servers and instances where you want to run the tests, on other machines, other VMs, or other physical hosts. So to download DBA tools, if you go back to the blog, and the DBA tools link is there. And once you get onto the website, I recommend you check over the documentation and the minimum requirements. Now, for this demonstration, I will be using the offline install option because I'm going to be installing this on a Hyper-V VM that doesn't have internet connectivity enabled. So we have to download the source control, the code and the executables and etc. The modules for DBA tools to install onto that server. Now there is a option down here on the offline install page to download as a .zip file from GitHub. So if you just select that option, it'll then give you the download link. So just save that to the same folder. I just want to point out this little line down here. It does tell you, it gives you instructions, how to put this on your machine, but it does give you some instructions to say that you need to rename the folders that come with the download DBA Tools Master and DBA Tools Development, just to DBA Tools, which we'll go through later in this video. If you've not used DBA Tools, I highly recommend it. It's a very useful module that comes with a number of different functions that are specifically been written by the community to help DBAs and other database professionals managing the data. You can do a number of different things on here. You can use them to backup databases. There's commands to fail over databases to different instances, install databases, set up logins, etc. It's really useful. I definitely recommend having a look at this if you don't already use it. In our case, the scripts that I've developed for deploying HammerDB use this to create jobs on the SQL instances where you're going to be running the workload in addition to capturing that information and writing it into SQL tables, so you can report on that at a later date. So once you've downloaded DBA Tools, the next thing that you're going to need to do is get the scripts that I've put together, which are the ones that you'll use to deploy HammerDB across your environment. So for that, if you go to the HammerDB GitHub link, the Swarchy HammerDB benchmark, and if you go to code in the top right hand corner, there's an option to download this as a zip. So I'll just save that to the same folder as well. So for the demonstration, we're going to be using Hyper-V VM called SQL03, and on SQL03, if I just log us onto there, I'm currently logged in as an administrator, and we're going to copy the files that we just downloaded over to a folder on this server. So I think I'll probably just put it in my temp folder and just copy it directly over from the device that was connected to the internet. So if we just copy them files over to there, and once you've done that, the next thing we'll need to do is install the DBA Tools module. So if you're anything like me, you'll probably, So if you're anything like me, you'll probably have forgotten where the default folder for PowerShell modules is. I'll just expand the screen to make it bigger. So if that's the case, what you can do, you can run the command environment ps module path, and this will tell you the default locations that PowerShell will look, the executable will look for modules under your profile. I typically tend to put them into C program files, Windows PowerShell modules, because every person's or user account that logs onto the Windows box will usually check in that location for the modules when you try and install them. So if you open that up with File Explorer, so we'll go open up File Explorer and just go to that folder. So you can see there's already some modules there that have come with Windows, and we will copy that across just like that. And if you recall, on the DBA Tools website, so back on here, I accidentally closed it off, back on the website, official install guide, it tells you what you have to rename the folders to down at the bottom. So it should just be DBA Tools like that. So if we go back onto SQL03 and we'll extract everything out, which might take a moment. Okay, so once that's extracted out, you can just rename that to DBA Tools. One thing to note is there's a folder with a subfolder within. I believe you have to copy the subfolder out, so then that's in the root of the module directory. And then once you've copied this out, you can then rename it to DBA Tools. Okay, so that's done. And if we now just rename that to DBA Tools on its own, as it said on the website. Okay, and then if we go back into PowerShell and just do import module DBA Tools, and it should then start scanning, and this is just to check that the module's installed correctly. So whilst that's just loading the module, we can just go to commands, and for an example, we could run a query, a DBA query, using the commandlet. So invoke DBA query. This is an example of one of the commandlets that comes with the module. So you've got your invoke DBA query commandlet, and then SQL instance, server name, and the actual query you want to run. So if we just take a copy of that, and now that that has returned the prompt, if we try running a select, I've got another SQL instance which is called SQL02, and that's where we're going to eventually intend to run the scripts against. So if I just have a quick look, I think I've got Management Studio open here actually. If you go into test AG01, don't have any tables, I could just create a quick dummy table just to test this out. Matter of fact, it might be just as easy to do a select from a system table, a DMV, select top one everything from sys databases, and if we just hit enter, okay, so you can see it's brought back some results. It's come back with the master database, which is obviously there installed with the SQL02 instance. So we're happy now that the module's installed, so we can clear the screen. And the second step of the prerequisites for the install, if you go back to the HammerInstall folder, you'll now need to extract the HammerDB 4.1 media that we downloaded. So if we extract that into this folder, I think I'll just skip this whilst it's extracting. Okay, so the HammerDB one is now the HammerDB 4.1 is now extracted, and I'm going to delete the zip file so it's not using up space unnecessarily. So now the last part of the setup will require you to extract the Swarchy HammerDB files, the files from that I've put together. So if you just do the same with them and extract them into the directory. And again, I'll just remove the zip, and we'll just check what we have there. So we've got the HammerDB scripts, and I think what I'll do, just for tidiness, I will just copy the root folder into this directory. Okay, so now by this point we've gone through the prerequisites. We have downloaded HammerDB and copied that over onto the deployment server. We've got DBA tools installed, and we've checked that by running a select function that's included with that module. And we've also extracted the Swarchy HammerDB scripts out. We've already done this, copied the files to the deployment server, which in our case is SQL03. And the next step is to have a quick look at the workload config files. So if I just go back onto SQL03 and into the Hammer scripts that we downloaded, you should see in here there's a folder called workload config. And if you go into workload config, you should see that there are two .tcl files. I believe that's short for tickle language. Just double check that. .tcl. I remember this because it made me laugh. Yeah, pronounced tickle, but essentially it's a command line type driven language. Well, I suppose I shouldn't really say that. I mean, it gives you a brief overview here. Casts everything in the mold of a command, even programming constructs like variable assignments and procedure definition. Essentially, this is what HammerDB, the executable, uses in order to run, the workload tests. So if I just go back onto there and show you one of these, you can open them up in Excel in Notepad. So if we just do open with Notepad, and you'll see the basic outline of the file. So there's various different commands that you can issue as part of these TCL files. That in this case, this one creates the database that you're going to be using as the test to drive the benchmark. So you can specify, how you want the creation of that database to be logged, what drivers you want to connect to the SQL instance with, what type of or variants of tests that you're going to be running, and there is other configuration you can set, which is all documented on HammerDB's website. Likewise, this is the actual workload .tcl script, which again you specify in here how many users you may have, for instance, so VU, virtual users, any delays and iterations that you need between your tests. And I will go into more detail about this in a separate blog and potentially another video. But just for now, because this is a demo on how to get the environment set up and run your first test, I'm not going to go into any great detail. The way that the scripts have been written are they call a batch file. So the batch file then calls on the HammerDB CLI batch file, which then calls the executables for HammerDB, and we pass through the workload files, the TCL files, as part of this batch file in order to get the process running. So that's just to give you a bit of an overview of how this works. But in terms of the next steps, once you've set up your workload config files, so the TCL files, we're now ready to start the install with the PowerShell scripts. So if you go back onto the instance and just load up PowerShell ISE, I tend to recommend you just run this as an administrator. Otherwise, sometimes you can run into problems with permissions on directories and such. And if you open the Hammer scripts directory, the script that you're going to need to run in order to set this up is the install HammerDB script. And essentially, this runs a function to which we pass parameters and different arguments. So if you scroll down to the bottom of the script, this is the line that we need to change here, or I should say we need to set for the environment that we want to set the benchmarking up on. So essentially the function looks in a source directory, which is the directory where the script is actually saved, and it uses that in order to be able to get the media and the other scripts that it needs to copy over to SQL Server 02, the other instance, where it will install the HammerDB, and it will set up a SQL agent job to run this on a reoccurring basis. So For us, we just need to check that we've got the correct path to the install media that we downloaded. So if I just double check that, if I drag that across to here. So in our case, we've got the scripts stored in this script folder here, and it's going to look in the folder above this. So it will go to the HammerInstall folder and then into HammerDB 4.1 Win, HammerDB 4.1, and as part of that it will copy all the executables across to the other machine. So before it copies the HammerDB executables that you downloaded, you want to make sure, if you go back into the Hammer scripts directory, back into the workload config, you want to make sure that you copy these files, which dictate the workload that you're going to run. You want to make sure that you copy them into the actual HammerDB download, just into the root of there. So you can see they've now been added, the two batch files I mentioned and the TCL files. And then we just want to check where it's going to install this on the other machine. So it's going to install it on the D drive. So if we just check what's already on the D drive of SQL02, just you can see the D drive of SQL02 is empty. So it's going to create a folder in here called HammerDB benchmark, and it will copy the HammerDB media across to here, along with our workload TCL file and our build TCL file and the batch files that we've set up. And then in addition to that, what it should do is it will create two SQL agent jobs on here, one to run the workload, to run the actual benchmark, and another one to collect the results of that benchmark at a later time. And you can specify where that data gets input as part of the setup. So just to show you how this works, once you've set all the parameters down here, which I will put some documentation on the blog with some more information about how to use these, you should be in a position to just run the script at the top. In this case, we got an error. Install HammerDB, the media folder is empty. Download the latest version of HammerDB and save it. So I might just echo the root just to double check this, where the root is looking at. Just run that. So it's saying that the root is in ctemp HammerDbInstall, ctemp HammerDB, HammerInstall, yes, and Hammer Media. Okay, so it's something I forgot to mention there. You need to copy the actual media there into this Hammer Media folder, which it creates on the first time that you run the script. And just on that point, having the separate folder, the Hammer Media folder, is kind of useful because it allows for future updates to the HammerDB application itself. On future updates, you can just download that and copy the new Hammer Media into this folder, and then on subsequent reruns of the scripts, it should redeploy back onto the servers where you're using HammerDB at the moment. That's if you want to put the latest version on, and obviously you have to bear in mind that there may be changes between the different versions which may skew or change the NOPM and TPM results that you get back from the benchmark. But anyhow, I'll delete the setup scripts that it generated in here, just so we can start from fresh. And as we were saying, we've set the commands now at the bottom, and the HammerDB media is in the correct folder. So you should now just be able to run this, and if we have a look there, it's generated a log, and if we just go across to SQL02 and look on the D drive, you can see it's created a HammerDB benchmark folder on the root of that drive. Oops. It'll take a moment or so to run because it does have to copy the contents of that HammerDB media folder across. I forget exactly how big that is. Okay, so once it's done, you should get a message like this that'll inform you where there's a robocopy log that gets generated as part of copying the media across and the relevant scripts, and then it'll also generate a general log about the process, which you can open with the command. If you just highlight the command as such and just copy that and paste it into the prompt, you can open up the main error log, or the main information log, I should say. So in here you can see successfully created the directory. It's copied the files over to the D HammerDB benchmark folder. It's copied the media across, and it's run two SQL scripts as well, which create the jobs. And if you just have a look at the SQL02 folder, I'm going to HammerDB benchmark. You can see there the scripts have been copied over. I mean, at the moment it does copy over the entirety of the scripts, which maybe is unnecessary and something that might change in the future. But for now, this is just a kind of work in progress. And as I mentioned, it creates the Hammer media folder in there, which you'll use when the scripts actually run. And just to point out, there is also the robocopy log that it generates in the HammerInstall setup logs folder, which is there, so you can check that as well, and just make sure that you're happy that everything you're expecting is moved across. Essentially, you're just looking for these down here, 0 failed, and it gives you some information about the time. So with that being all in place, if we just have a look at what's on the SQL02 instance now, just refresh the agent jobs. You should see there's now a HammerDB benchmark job and a HammerDB log import job. So the HammerDB benchmark job is the SQL agent job that calls the workload, and it creates the actual benchmark results. And then, as you'd expect, the HammerDB log imports them results at the end of that process. Now, usually I schedule them to run, at different times. So you may want to run a few different benchmarks throughout the day at different times, which you can schedule with your normal SQL scheduler in here. By default, the jobs don't come with any schedule, so it's up to you to define what works best for your environment. The HammerDB log import I usually schedule to run towards the end of the night, so then it collects everything from the tests that have run during the day. So just to show you what's inside the main job, if you just open that up and have a look at the steps. So you've got 4 steps in total. The first step will drop the existing database if one exists. So there's a database that gets created as part of the test called TPCC, and if it exists, that will check if it's there, and it will remove it because we want to recreate that as part of our build definition that we set in one of the TCL scripts, and that's what gets called in the second step. So if you just have a look at that, you can see that it goes into the D directory, HammerDB benchmark, Hammer media, and then it calls the auto run build batch command. So if you just have a look at the next step, so step 3, this will start by setting the database that the workload TCL script creates, that HammerDB creates, to simple recovery, and we've also pre-sized the MDF and the LDF logs. These are specific to the tests that I was originally wanting to run. We were trying to simulate the performance of a simple recovery database with no transaction log backups running, and we didn't want the auto growth events to impact the results. Every time the MDF or the LDF files had to grow into disk, it would incur a performance impact, a wait whilst it extends into that drive space. So we've pre-sized the database before the actual workload runs so that it doesn't affect the results the same. And then there's the final step, which is step 4, which actually runs the workload itself. So just to demo how that works, if I start the job at step, and we'll start it at step 1, just leave that running, and if we jump onto SQLO2, so here on SQLO2, if you look in Task Manager, you should see the actual workload process running. So just organize that by CPU. So this TCLSH application, that is the executable that gets called whilst the build's being executed, and that's the same executable gets called when the actual workload gets run as well, which is the 4th step of the job. So as you can see on here, that's still running on step 2, and how long that'll take will vary depending on the configuration of the environment that you're running the scripts against. If you've got a high spec machine, it'll obviously be a lot quicker. If you're building a lot of warehouses and you're having a lot of virtual users and things, then obviously it takes longer. What you should see is it'll create the database TPCC that I mentioned earlier, and this is where the schema is contained for what the actual test will run. So I'm just going to leave that running and come back to that once it's completed. Okay, so as you can see, the test is now completed. There we go, completed successfully, succeeded. You can have a look at the history of the job. If we just expand that out, so you can see it took 10 minutes in total to run, and step 4, where it runs the actual workload, it records varied information about the workload that it runs, and you can just go through and check that the steps were successful as well. So that's the build step, and then the reconfiguration of the database, and then the actual workload. It records each of the outputs from that, and then ultimately the end result that you're looking at is the file that it creates on the server where you've been running your test. So just back on SQLO2, what you should now have is a log file generated in the temp directory of the account that runs the SQL agent job. So I believe on here, if I go in Configuration Manager, my SQL agent account is set up to tickle SVC SQLA. Tickle being named after the Mr. Men books, Mr. Tickle. So you'll have to go to the C users directory, C users directory, and then into that particular users folder. And then if you go into the app data folder, local temp, you then see that you've got 2 files. The first file, the generic HammerDb.log, is what gets created when you build the schemas, or when you create the actual TPCC database. So if you were to run this through the command line, this is what it would be generated, and it logs the details of any of the builds that you've done. So I've previously run some on here in the past. You can see from the 3rd of May there, but it appends the most recent one every time you do a new build. So you should see the one there that we've just run this afternoon, and what you're looking for is TPC schema complete message to be logged at the bottom. And then in addition to that, the way that the workloads have been set up to run, it generates a unique log file in the directory every time that the benchmark test is run. So it gives it this kind of hexadecimal number at the end appended to it. And within this log file are the stats that you're ultimately looking for, which are the NOPM, number of operations per minute, and transactions per minute counters that are recorded at the bottom of the file. So as you'd imagine, once you've run this a number of times, you'll end up with a number of different hammer logs that are very similar to this within this directory. And then having to get them results can be quite a bit of a pain, because you have to go into each file individually and take the results out, copy them into Excel or whatever reporting tool you're using. So back on SQL 03, if I just go back to where Management Studio is, so back on the Management Studio, the HammerDB log import job will take care of that import process. But the one thing to bear in mind is that you do have to make a config change on here depending on where your local directory is. We'll just go into the job just to show you what it does. So it calls the HammerDB import PowerShell script, which is on the D drive of the SQL02 server that we've deployed the scripts to. So if we just go back to SQL02, so back on SQL02, we'll have to go to that folder. So it's on the D drive, this PC, D, HammerDB benchmark, and the import script is the one that we'll have to change and just check the config that's set in there. So HammerDB import, and if we just go to edit that, and once the script loads, you need to get down to the bottom of the script where you call the function. So you have to pass some input parameters into the function. The first one is the base folder, so the folder where all the HammerDB install media and your log repositories are going to be saved. This second parameter, Hammer logs folder, is the temp directory of whatever service account you run SQL agent with. So you can find that if you go to start on your SQL server and into configuration manager. So it's the SQL agent account, in which case for us this will be tickle/svc SQLA. So the temp folder for that you'd be able to find by going to this PC, C drive, users. Every user on the Windows has a user folder related to their profile. If you go into the SVC SQLA and then go into app data local temp, this is where the previous job that runs the benchmark creates the actual file itself, and we just need to make sure that the script knows where to look to pick up the files to process into a CSV for us. Right up at the moment, I've set that to CSV. I am working on changing the script so then you can use SQL as a data source to write the results to as well. Log SQL instance in this case is SQL02. That's primarily used just to name the files and that you get generated with this script. The CSV file and the log files, it'll rename them, so SQL02 is appended to the file names. Obviously at the moment they're just this weird hexadecimal type number, so they don't really make much sense as they are, but that'll be renamed as part of the script. The log database, this is really only required if you are going to be saving it to an SQL database. In this example, I'm not going to do that. I'm still working on the scripts to be able to include that functionality at a later date. So you just need to make sure that that line has been set appropriately, and make sure you save that. And then, so just back on SQL03, you see we've got the HammerDB log import job there. As we just have a look inside the job, you'll see it calls the script that we just edited on the D drive. And just have a look at what we've got on SQL02 at the moment. So we'll go to SQL02's D drive, HammerDB benchmark. So that's the folder there with all our scripts and configuration from earlier. And just to show what the file, the actual result file looks like at the moment on the D drive, on the C drive in the users directory. Just go to the C drive, user, then into the SQL agent user, app data, local, and into temp. So we've got the file there ready to be processed with our results. So if we just start the job from step 1, we just wait for that to complete. So it's completed now. If we go back to and then go back to the temp directory, you see that the original log file is gone. But then on the D drive of SQL02, we've now got 3 new folders. So Hammer log, Hammer result, and Hammer processed. So the Hammer log folder is a log of the import job or the import process, and it just tells you how many log files have been processed as part of that run. And then we've got the Hammer processed folder, which contains the original log file that was generated when we ran the benchmark. That's renamed, so it's got the SQL02 server name appended to the start of it, and it's dated and timestamped according to when the file was created. So if you just look into there, your results are there. And then in addition to that, you get the Hammer results folder, which is where the CSV file is created that contains the actual results. Now, if you take a look at that, you can open that up with Notepad, so it's comma separated file. Or if you've got Excel, then you can take that onto your machine where you've got Excel installed and open that up, and you should see the data in a column format. So it tells you what file that was imported from, and it gives you the results there as well. And if you want, you can just compare that back to the original file if you ever wanted to check in the processed file folder. So we'll just minimize that, and you can see TPM 66,328 and NOPM is 28,894. And that's pretty much all there is to setting this up then. Once this is in place, you can set your schedules, so your benchmarks to run, and then typically at the end of the night I'd set a schedule to import the logs that have been generated in the temp directory of the SQL agent account. You could use a proxy account if you prefer. I've just got it set to use SQL agent in this example, but hopefully this is something that could be useful. I think there's still a lot of development work and changes that I'd want to make. Like I say, I've been looking at working on importing this data into a SQL table instead of a CSV, or having the option to use both. But I hope it's useful for some people, and the amount of work I'll spend on developing it is just something I do in my spare time. So it really depends on whether it's useful for folks. So if you do find it useful, let me know in the comments. But otherwise, I hope this has been interesting for you, and I hope that you've gained something useful out of it.